Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo wine info video, and today we're discussing the mystery allure of the cultivar of Clairette Blanche, because it seems to be a grape that no one anywhere in the world gets particularly excited about, except for some of South Africa's most legendary winemakers. People like Eben Sadi and Andrea Molyneux, Whiteman and Sons, and the people who made today's wine of the day, Radford Dale, all are quite enchanted by the cultivar. Which is why today we are exploring Radford Dale's first Clairette Blanche, made by winemaker Petrone Thomas. I guess the question we have to ask is, have our finest winemakers all gone mad? Or is South Africa able to get something out of Clairette Blanche that perhaps the rest of the world is not? The name Clairette Blanche means light white grape. In France, they generally just call it Clairette. But ampelographer and DNA specialist Dr. José Vuyamo suspects that the reason is not because it is a light white grape, because there are hundreds of light white grapes around France, but rather because they have a small collection of very light white hairs on the underside of the vine leaves. Clairette Blanche is one of France's oldest grape cultivars, with claims that it goes back to the 1400s, although there's no real historical evidence for that. The earliest actual historical evidence can be found in about the mid-1500s, but this is still pretty old. To give you context, Cabernet Sauvignon has its earliest historical references in about the 1760s. At one point, Clairette Blanche was really very widely planted across the southern Rhone and was used prodigiously as a blending grape with cultivars like Grenache Blanc. But the plantings have dwindled over the last 50 years to the point where there are now only about 2,000 hectares in the entire country of France. There's only 150 hectares in Italy. And in South Africa, while there used to be more than 300 hectares, there's now roughly 135 hectares. And most of that has dropped off in the last 5 years. But it is a cultivar that really loves very poor soils and dry terrain, which makes the Swartland its perfect home. And that's why when it's there, it just kind of hunkers down and keeps a low profile, hoping that no one notices it so that they pull it up and plant Shannon. But as I said, there is something about this grape that has captured the imagination of some of our finest winemakers to use it as either a blending component or as a standalone rockstar cultivar wine. One of those producers is Radford Dale. Radford Dale is a partnership between Ben Radford and Alex Dale. Ben Radford was the 5th generation in a long line of vigneron grape farmers in the Barossa Valley in Australia. And Alex Dale, from the age of 15, had been in the vineyards and making wine in Burgundy, France. So I guess in some senses, Stellenbosch was a sort of philosophical but also literal middle ground. Now, initially when they launched their project, they would source grapes from the Swartland for their red wines, grapes from Elgin for their Pinot Noir, and grapes from Stellenbosch for their Chardonnays. But more recently, Radford Dale has finally invested in what was Elgin Ridge in Elgin, and it's now called Radford Dale Organics, where they produce only organic farm fruit, focusing on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Of course, Radford Dale as an outfit have been associated with regenerative viticulture and natural wines for a very long time. In fact, they import a number of incredible natural wines, but this Radford Dale Organics project gives them a really reliable access to organic certified fruit for their wine. That said, the rest of their ranges, the Terroir range and the Venum range and the Thirst range, are mostly produced in Stellenbosch. And this Clairette Blanche comes from Stellenbosch. Perhaps one final thing to note about them is that they are in no way shy of being niche. And you can tell this by looking at their Thirst range, because they have a red wine made from Gamay Noir, and they were the only people to bottle a Gamay Noir. In fact, they've been the only people in the last 20 years in South Africa to plant Gamay Noir vineyards. And the other wine is Clairette Blanche, again, one of only a handful of single cultivar Clairette Blanche wines in the entire country. Now, we've mentioned that this cultivar of Clairette Blanche keeps drawing people back to it. So I guess the only way we can really know for sure why it does that is by getting into the glass and tasting it for ourselves. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, one of the first things I notice is a really interesting mix of kind of beeswax and some gravel. And that I associate with a number of Clairette Blanches that we've tasted in South Africa before. And we're going to pick up that beeswax note on the palate as well later. But there is also some other stuff. There's a little more fruit going on, maybe some nectarine, some unripe peach, and a very gentle touch of almost like baby's breath floral. It's quite subtle, but really nice. So when we give it a sip, well, the first thing we do notice is the chewiness that I mentioned earlier. And that texture really is a hallmark of Clairette Blanche in South Africa, partially because Clairette Blanche is renowned for its particularly hardy skins. Now, whether they are thick or thin kind of depends on who you talk to. And wine journalist Maylou Lambert says a lot of it has to do with clonal variation. But Petronet Thomas tells us that really the skins are roughly the same as a Chenin Blanc thickness, but they are particularly sticky. This wine actually sits on its skins for 2 days prior to fermentation because Petronet wants to get some of those flavors out of the skin to really enrich those fruit components. But let's see what else there is. Well, another thing that people say about Clairette Blanche is that it generally lacks acidity. Now, in France, this is partially because they let it go a bit riper, so you get a higher alcohol. You also get a thicker, oilier mouthfeel, whereas here they've harvested a little bit earlier. So you do get some sense of citric vibrance to it, although the acidity is by no means eye-watering. Another really interesting element about this wine is that over the kind of notes of melon rind and nectarine, there's a lovely saltiness. It's almost savory, and this is just a beautiful effect. Again, I think partially from that skin contact, but also just a character of the grape itself. So that's all we have time for today, but I have left links to 2 videos, one of which covers the Whiteman & Sons Clairette Blanche from Swartland, and the other one explores Radford Dale's other niche bottling, the Vinum Gamay Noir. I hope both of these give you a broader picture of the great work that these guys are doing.